The water hit me like a fist the moment I went under. May in Temagami doesn't care about your age. The lakes hold their winter cold deep into the season. I knew this from 4 decades of RCMP service in Northern Ontario. Knew it the way you know a dangerous animal, by reputation and by respect. 7 degrees Celsius, maybe 8. The kind of cold that turns your muscles to concrete inside 10 minutes, that fills your lungs like a second drowning. You fall into a backcountry lake in May without a dry suit, and your body starts making decisions without you shortly after. I was 63 years old when I jumped in after my grandson. "Grandpa!" His voice hit me before I even had my bearings, somewhere to my left, half swallowed by the water and the wind. I found him by sound before I found him by sight. Both hands gripping the hull of his overturned canoe, knuckles white, lips already the wrong color. He'd been in the water at least 2 minutes, maybe 3. I swam. My right knee sent up its usual complaint about cold. My left shoulder, the one that's never fully forgiven me since a training incident outside, Regina screamed for about 10 seconds and then went mercifully numb. I'm not built for speed anymore. I'm built for endurance, for showing up, for continuing past the point where a reasonable man would stop. 40 years of RCMP service will do that to a person. It takes things from you and leaves other things in their place. What I remember most from those 90 seconds in the water was not the cold and not the pain. It was the silence from the shore. Not the silence of the Canadian wilderness in spring. I know that silence. I love it. I've spent most of my retirement chasing it north of Huntsville, out where the only sounds are loons and wind and your own breathing. This was different. This was a watching silence. 2 figures standing perfectly still on a rocky shelf of shoreline, not shouting, not throwing the rescue rope that was coiled right there at their feet, not moving toward the water, not doing a single useful thing. I noticed it the way you notice an engine that's stopped when it should still be running. And I thought, so it's real. I was right. God help me. I was right. I should tell you something about myself before I explain what happened on that lake, because none of what followed makes sense without it. My name is not important. My grandson calls me Chief, has since he was 8 years old, and found a photograph of me in full RCMP inspector dress uniform at an Ottawa ceremony. He thought it was the funniest title he'd ever heard applied to the man who made him grilled cheese on Saturday mornings and fell asleep during hockey games. The name stuck. I don't mind it. I earned it over 32 years of service in major crimes and fraud investigation, the last 12 as an inspector heading a unit out of Sudbury. I know this is not what most people picture when they hear retired grandfather. That is, historically, an advantage. After the RCMP, I moved back to the small town outside Huntsville where I grew up and took on part-time consulting work for a private security firm run by my former partner, a woman named Margaret, who has forgotten more about investigative work than most active officers will ever learn. I stay sharp. I shoot at the range every other week. I keep a personal locator beacon in my pack whenever I go into the backcountry, the kind that sends a direct distress signal to the Canadian Mission Control Center in Trenton, and doesn't need a cell tower to do it. Old habits from a career spent thinking about worst cases. My grandson is Daniel. 28, works for an engineering firm in Calgary, has a laugh that fills whatever room he walks into. He also has a 3-year-old daughter named Lily who calls me Gramps and insists on the same 2 books every single visit in the same order, with no variations tolerated. He's been raising her largely on his own since a difficult split with Lily's mother 2 years prior, and it had not been easy on him. He was tired in the specific way that single parents are tired, not defeated, never that, but worn thin around the edges. He'd been with his girlfriend for just over 2 years when all of this happened. I'll say this plainly. I never liked her, not for any single demonstrable reason in those early months. She was polished. She was attentive. She laughed at the right times and asked the right questions. She was, on the surface, exactly the kind of person you'd want showing up at Christmas dinner. What bothered me was underneath the surface. Her stories never quite connected at the edges when you listened carefully. There was a small, controlled quality to her warmth, like a fire that's been built to look large but isn't generating actual heat. I've spent 40 years learning to trust that kind of observation. I kept my concerns to myself and watched. In November, I flew out to Calgary for Lily's birthday. Over dinner, Daniel mentioned that he'd updated his life insurance policy. His girlfriend had encouraged it. He said they were planning to get engaged. It made sense to have the right coverage before the wedding. $800,000 in term life, with her listed as primary beneficiary. At 28, with a mortgage and a daughter, it wasn't unreasonable. I asked a few questions. I tried to make sound casual. When had she brought it up? How long from conversation to signing? Where were the documents kept? He gave me the look that young people give when they think an older person is being overcautious. "Chief," he said, "it's just insurance. Everyone has it." "Of course," I said. I drove back to my hotel that night with a weight in my chest that I've learned, over many decades, not to dismiss. The Temagami trip was her idea. She framed it as a gift, a long weekend in the backcountry before wedding planning consumed everything, a chance for Daniel and me to spend real time together in the wilderness we'd always talked about visiting. She and her brother would handle logistics and come along for company. She'd rented 2 canoes, booked a backcountry campsite on a remote lake, accessible only by water, organized all the gear. It was generous. It was thoughtful. It was also, I noticed, a trip to a location with no cell service, no other boats, and a 3-kilometer paddle across open cold water as the only way in or out. I said it sounded wonderful. I called Margaret the day after the invitation and gave her a full briefing. I also placed a quiet call to a contact in the provincial insurance fraud unit, someone I'd worked with during my last years at the RCMP. The policy had not been flagged yet, but my contact agreed to open a preliminary review and stay available. Then I packed my gear, clipped my PLB to the side pocket of my pack, where I could reach it without looking, and drove north. The night before we launched, I couldn't sleep. I was up before 2, sitting at the kitchen table of the rental cabin with a cup of tea, running through what I knew and what I didn't know. I heard her voice from the next room, low and careful, the voice of someone who thinks they're not being overheard. The walls in that place were old and thin. I didn't try to listen. I just heard. 2 phrases reached me clearly through the wall. Her voice. "He goes in the water out there. No signal. What are they going to say happened?" Then her brother's voice. Lower. 1 word. Policy. Then her voice again. "Exactly." I sat completely still for 30 seconds. Then I went back to my room, sent Margaret a 3-word text we'd established years ago for situations requiring quiet backup without an emergency response. Confirmed she'd received it when she replied in 4 minutes, "She's always been a light sleeper," and went to sleep. I needed to be clear-headed in the morning. Everything I'd just heard was inadmissible. It was context. The evidence would come tomorrow, and I needed to be present and functional when it did. I've had harder nights. The lake was called Lac Fort, a beautiful name for a body of water that clearly did not feel obligated to be beautiful. Long, narrow, cold, hemmed in by granite ridges on both sides, with the backcountry campsite at the far end. 3 kilometers of open paddling from the put-in. The morning was clear and still, temperature around 4 degrees, the lake surface flat and gray. Daniel and I paddled together. They were in the second canoe behind us. It was a good morning in spite of everything, or perhaps because I knew what the morning was and had resolved to be present in it. The loons were calling somewhere in the mist to the north. The paddles made their quiet sound. Daniel talked about Lily's daycare, about the Fort McMurray project, about where he wanted to honeymoon. He was relaxed and happy and completely unaware of anything. And sitting behind him with a paddle in my hands, I felt the full weight of what I was doing and why. And I didn't let it slow me down. Around the 40-minute mark, I noticed their canoe changing position, pulling slightly ahead of us and to the left, putting them roughly 20 meters off our port side. Not behind us anymore. Flanking. It wasn't a natural drift. It was a repositioning. I tracked it in my peripheral vision without turning my head. "Tell me more about the Fort McMurray project," I said to Daniel. He started talking. I reached into my side pocket and armed the PLB. Not activated. Armed. Threshold position. 1 deliberate press away from sending our GPS coordinates and a distress code to Trenton, triggering search and rescue. I've worked with those teams. Average response time to a location like Lac 4, 45 to 70 minutes by helicopter out of North Bay, depending on conditions. I knew exactly what would happen the moment that signal transmitted. I listened to Daniel talk and I paddled and I waited. The canoe lurched at the 2-kilometer mark. Later, RCMP technical investigators would spend 3 hours examining the hull under proper lighting. They found 2 holes drilled through the fiberglass in the stern section below the waterline, each plugged with a compressed organic compound, the specific type used in fishing lures to create controlled buoyancy degradation available at any outdoors supply store. The plugs were designed to soften and dissolve gradually in cold, fresh water. Not immediately, not in the first half hour, but at 2 kilometers, with 2 adults and gear aboard, the water that had been accumulating below the floorboards shifted catastrophically to the stern. The canoe went over in under 4 seconds. The cold was total. I had 1 second underwater before my training oriented me. I surfaced, located Daniel, disoriented, gasping, reaching for the overturned hull, and pressed the PLB. 1 press. Confirmed. Then I swam. I got to him. I got him stabilized on the hull, kept his face above water, kept talking to him. His grip was strong enough. He was going to hold. The silence from the shoreline lasted about 20 seconds. Then I heard the sound of her brother entering the water, and I turned to look, and his trajectory was not toward Daniel. It was toward me. Direct. Purposeful. The way a person moves when they're not going to a place but going to a target. I let him come. He was younger than me by a significant margin, heavier through the chest. He had not spent 4 decades learning how force, water resistance, and momentum interact when one person has technique and one person is operating on adrenaline and a plan. The lake was not ideal terrain, but the principles don't change with the terrain. I let him grab my shoulder, which is what he reached for, and used his own momentum and the resistance of the water to move him into a control position he hadn't anticipated. It's not clean in a lake. It's effective enough. He came up, coughing and very still, treading water, staring at me. "Stay where you are," I said. Then I turned back to my grandson. We reached the rock shelf by the shoreline. All 4 of us, eventually. Daniel was shaking badly, hypothermia advancing, but he was coherent and responsive, and the color was coming back, if slowly. I kept him moving slightly, kept talking to him, kept one eye on the other 2. She was standing 6 feet away. Her face had moved through several expressions since I came out of the water, and had settled on something careful and assessing. Her brother sat apart on the rocks, arms wrapped around his knees, eyes on the water. Search and rescue was in the air. I had pressed the button. I knew what was coming, and roughly when. "You drilled the holes last night," I said to her. It wasn't a question. She looked at me with the expression of someone running calculations. "It was an accident," she said. "The canoe was old. There must have been damage we didn't know about." "The PLB went active 19 minutes ago," I said. "RCMP and search and rescue have our exact coordinates. They're already airborne." Something shifted in her face. "Not much. Enough. The hull will be recovered and examined," I said. "The compound used to plug the drill holes will be identified and sourced. Your phone records will be subpoenaed. The conversation you had through a wall last night at approximately 2 in the morning has already been documented and communicated to my former colleague in the RCMP fraud unit, who has had an open file on the insurance policy since last week." I paused. The lake was absolutely still. Somewhere far up the tree line, a raven called once and went silent. I spent 32 years investigating major crimes and fraud for the RCMP, I said. I have built criminal cases on considerably less than what the Crown already has access to. I'd suggest you think carefully about what you say next, and whether you'd like to say it before or after speaking with a lawyer. Her brother said, very quietly, "How long have you known?" "Long enough to be here," I said. She tried once more. She straightened her shoulders and said, "You're 63. You're bleeding. We're 3 kilometers from the put-in with no signal. Nothing that happens here means anything." I looked at her for a moment. "Search and rescue is approximately 25 minutes out," I said. My former partner at the RCMP has had the full file since 2:15 this morning. The insurance fraud unit flagged the policy last Tuesday. You have a short window to make a decision about how you'd like to proceed. I'd use it carefully. She looked at me for a long time. Her face went very still. The helicopter reached us 17 minutes later. The officers who came off that aircraft were thorough and professional in the way I'd spent a career trying to develop in people. They worked the scene efficiently, secured the canoe and its hull, and took separate statements from all four of us before the afternoon was out. Daniel was airlifted to the hospital in New Liskeard, mild hypothermia, a laceration on his forearm from the canoe edge, otherwise intact. She and her brother were transported to the OPP detachment in Temiskaming Shores. I sat in a waiting room, drank coffee from a hallway machine that was an insult to coffee, and called my daughter to tell her Daniel was safe before she heard anything on the news. That phone call was the hardest part of the day. The investigation that followed took 6 weeks and involved the OPP, the RCMP Major Crimes and Fraud Units, and the insurance company's own investigators who confirmed they had received a query about the policy and had quietly opened a file. The charges, when they came, were substantial. Conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, criminal fraud, tampering with a vessel, and several additional counts related to planning and preparation. Her brother accepted a plea arrangement. He received 14 years in federal penitentiary. She went to trial. The Crown Attorney presented the evidence methodically. The drill compound matched a product purchased on her credit card 6 days before the trip. The phone records corroborated the conversation through the wall. The insurance policy's timeline told its own story to anyone paying attention. She was convicted on all primary charges. The judge sentenced her to 23 years before parole eligibility. I was in the courtroom when the sentence was read. Daniel was beside me. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said softly, 23 years. Lily will be finishing university. Yes, I said. She planned this while she was living with us. He said it slowly, like he was still finding the edges of it, while Lily was sleeping in the next room. There wasn't a response that would help with that one. I didn't try to offer one. He turned and looked at me. Chief, how long did you actually know? I had serious concerns for months, I said. I had something close to certainty the night before the trip. And you still went on that lake with us. I had no evidence that would hold up in court. I needed them to commit to the plan in a way that left physical evidence. I needed to be present when they did. He was quiet for a while. Outside the courthouse, it was a gray October afternoon, the kind of northern Ontario October that smells like wood smoke and wet leaves and feels like the world is settling in for something long. You could have been killed, he said. I'd accounted for the variables I could control, I said. He made a sound that almost became a laugh. You sound like an incident report. 40 years? I said. It becomes the only way you know how to talk about certain things. He put his hand on my shoulder, deliberate and careful the way he's done since he was small, making sure I knew he was there. Thank you, he said. I don't have anything else. You don't need anything else, I said. We drove out to Huntsville that evening. My place. I made dinner pasta, nothing complicated, and we sat on the back deck while the last of the light left the lake. He called his mother. He called Lily, who informed him at some length that she had learned to do a somersault at daycare and that he had missed it and that this was a problem. He laughed the way he laughs when Lily is on the phone fully, with no hesitation, and it was the best sound I'd heard all day. He sat for a long time after he hung up, watching the water. I keep going back to the insurance policy, he said. She suggested it. I thought she was being responsible, being a partner. It looked that way, I said. That was the point. I almost didn't update it. Felt unnecessary at 28. She walked me through all the reasons. He shook his head slowly. Lily's name should have been on it. My daughter. Lesson learned, I said. Update it this week. The stars were coming out above the tree line. Somewhere on the dark water, a loon called once, and the sound crossed the lake and disappeared into the pines on the far side. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. When you first got worried. Because I had instinct and no facts, I said. If I'd been wrong, I'd have ended something good in your life without cause. If I'd been right but couldn't prove it, I'd have warned her and made it harder to catch her. Either outcome was worse than waiting until I had enough to act. You used the trip, he said quietly. I used it as the opportunity it was, I said. I tried to control everything I could control and accept the variables I couldn't. He nodded slowly, looking at the water. She thought you were just a retired old man. Most people do, I said. It's a significant advantage. He almost smiled. Margaret keeps telling you to write a book, doesn't she? She mentions it occasionally. Please don't, he said. Lily doesn't need that kind of influence at her age. I smiled. The lake was very still. October in northern Ontario, the kind of evening that settles into your bones and stays there for years, the smell of the cold water and the wood smoke from someone's fire down the shore, the stars getting bright above the granite ridges. She's going to grow up with her father, I said. That was the objective. Everything else is process. He didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. We sat there until the night was fully in, two Canadians on a dock, doing what Canadians do with the heavy things, which is to sit beside water and let the quiet work on it until there's room to breathe again. I've built my entire career on one belief, that preparation is not pessimism, that knowing what people are capable of and being ready for it is not a failure of faith in the world. It's the most honest form of love you can offer to the people you'd cross a cold lake for. I still believe that. I'll always believe that. If you have someone in your life you'd cross a cold lake for, check in on them. Pay attention to the silences. Listen to the things that don't quite connect at the edges. And if you ever head into the backcountry, please charge your PLB before you go. That one's just common sense.